as that process goes forward. But that'll be an internal commerce process that we have to get that approved and get that then submitted. And my hope is that we submit that sooner. It's not technically per the statute or per the proviso, it's not due until December 31st, but I'm hoping we can submit it sooner because the state energy strategy it's full steam ahead, but the schedule that project is on, if we can finalize the report from this group sooner rather than later, then it can be referenced in the state energy strategy and in conversations that are going to be occurring with the legislature pretty much starting in early November, although it sounds like Mel started them already. So anyway, that's kind of the plan going forward in terms of just the big picture. And so then I thought today maybe we could, and it's the will of the group really, but we could go through the findings and recommendations one more time, kind of the red line strikeout version that is attached to the calendar. And just make sure everybody's okay with that. If we need to tweak words, we can do it real time. And just end up with something at the end of today that everybody, at least if you can't completely support it, you can not oppose it. So, but I'm hoping that everybody feels good about it. So,
Kate, may I ask a big picture question, since, and this is something I think you and I have had some email exchanges on, but just want to hear it for the benefit of the group. Since you know what's happening with the state energy strategy and our premier recommendation is to align with the state energy strategy, can you just say overall, I mean, as you were drafting this and your team was drafting it, how well aligned are all of the recommendations sort of with features that are going to be appearing in the state energy strategy, so that we're lining up our preferences and we're having influence sort of that way, and not going orthogonal to or things that are silent in the state energy strategy? Just sort of the high level view of our bullet points versus do they all show up in the state energy strategy, and will this influence then how that gets implemented?
So I do feel, and I'm happy as we go through the items today we can kind of talk about that a little bit too. I don't think the strategy obviously will be much broader and have many, many more items in it than our document. And that's just due to the nature of the two different projects, right? I mean, CEF investments only go to certain things just because of the limited funds and because of the capital budget restrictions and because of all kinds of things. But yes, we have attempted very very directly to make sure that they're matching up and not going two different ways. In terms of the reforms to the CEF program, many of which are designed to be just, I'll say, more inclusive, however you define that. I think that's very consistent with all kinds of policy things going on, but specifically to the energy strategy and what we'll be doing in that process. I mean, so I think they're aligned. I think, Dan, you can speak then specifically to conversations you've had with Eileen Quigley, who's the consultant's lead on, and some of you may know her. She's leading the consultant team that's helping us with the technical side of this. Dan has had conversations with her specifically about kind of the innovation piece, I think.
Yeah. I was mainly, and I was really focusing on the one point of playing to the strengths of the sectors, industrial sectors that we have, and just wanting to make sure that there would be something there, because those are global sectors. They're not just state of Washington sectors, but they have the potential for large 100 mega ton scale contributions to global greenhouse gases through flying airplanes and running data centers and doing the things that we do in our state, that our state has technical leadership on, but with products where the emissions are taking place outside the state. And Eileen was clear that that would be not dissonant with anything, you know, and would be aligned with the state energy strategy. And that was my main concern in a specific point, but we have many other points other than that. And I'm happy the way you captured it within your document, sort of playing to the strengths. So just wanted to make sure that that was in there, because I was concerned the state energy strategy would only draw a box around the boundaries of the state of Washington and say, okay, we'll do consumption-based emissions for our electricity because that flows in from out of state, but everything else, the boundary of success is defined by the state of Washington, when in fact, we have so many opportunities through our export businesses to have massive impact on global carbon by creating an innovation ecosystem. Anyway, so I thought that point was well captured. Eileen said that that would not be inconsistent with the goals and scopes and aspirations of the state energy strategy. So I felt good about that point. I was more asking broadly, was there anything in here where it may be or just for the discussion, and we can do it point by point, you know, if you think it's best, that you can say this point does have a home. All I really want to hear is this point has a home in the state energy strategy, given that our primo thing is aligned with the state energy strategy. And since I haven't read it and it's not completely done, I want to make sure. Thanks.
Okay, fair enough. And Mel, I've noticed you had some comments in the chat, and so let's see, as we walk through the document, let's see if you want to just bring them up there, because that's totally appropriate and totally fine. And so just so everybody can hear them. I think, Alana, are you going to pull up the red line strikeout? Unless anybody wants to do something differently, I think we'll just walk through it. It shouldn't take us long. You all are very familiar with this document, but just to walk through and one more time and make sure everybody's okay where we're at. And then when you see your name and attribution, that you're comfortable with what we ended up with. This, and Alana, is there any way you can get the full recommendation on one slide, like make the font a little smaller so that we can see the whole, there you go. So we did tweak this one a little in response to some comments that Joel made. And in the first place, in my defense, accelerative is a word. I just wanted to, but anyway, Joel, do you want to speak to this a little bit? And I can't remember if the language is identical to what you and I went back and forth with, but let's make sure it captures what your thoughts were.
Well, I want to know what the source of that word is. It sounds like maybe it was coined by Fenner von Braun or somebody like that, but never mind. Yeah, so I mean, I was trying to kind of reconcile the tension between our mandate for innovation and the state policy dictate that you can't fund or provide incentives for something that is mandated. Yet recognizing that some of the things that are mandated, and I'm really thinking specifically of the HB 1257 on large existing buildings, which will be a real pioneering regulation by actually mandating retrofits for energy efficiency in large buildings, and thinking that there's really going to have to be some innovation in deep retrofits and in really deepening how we do building energy commissioning, or however you want to label operational savings. And in support of the compliance with that regulation in the private sector and in state buildings, it seems like there's certainly scope for some development, demonstration, innovation. And we don't want to exclude that if we can somehow kind of leave that window open. So we were trying to wordsmith a little bit to open that window, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just say that we worked, or Kate and I are working on that language too, and I think we're trying to get at the same point. It's how to say it in a way that's clear, but the sense of, yeah, we don't need Clean Energy Fund going to put in new solar farms out in Eastern Washington. Like, those things are going to happen. We already have those.
Or insulating roofs or whatever.
Right, but how do we spend CEF innovative money on innovation that we know is needed to fill in some of those gaps to reach those goals?
Yeah, and to pull down the cost curve and all that kind of stuff that we know is needed, and we fully anticipate happening, you know, when somebody does it, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it goes something like a solar plus storage. I know that's kind of seems simple these days, but the early stuff we didn't want to spend CEF money just on. Then like a solar plus storage, again, understanding how that actually operates in our state, what the advantages are, what the opportunities are. I think it's something like that. And I think the buildings is a great example of a place where that's, because we've got some heavy lifting to do at especially on the retrofit on the out years of those, some of those buildings. So yeah, but again, I think I know Kate struggled with a lot too. It's just trying to find the right wording that makes that clear to other people who aren't as intimately familiar with this as we are.
You know, and in the actual rule making and implementation, I mean, things like, is the data publicly available, and are there research partners or somebody that's going to be analyzing it, making publicly available knowledge, is a way to differentiate it, you know, whether there's a public good in that investment. So if it's an HVAC that's heavily instrumented and there's a team of people that are committed to analyzing that information and making it publicly available. We probably wouldn't go into that level of detail here, but if we have language that makes it clear that there are ways to signal, you know, something that is not just a retrofit, but is a public benefit for accelerating, as Joel and others have said.
Do we need to put the term publicly accessible in there?
To me, it's the easiest way to signal something as a public benefit is if the data and the outcomes and whatnot, but I don't know whether that restricts certain projects you want to do or not. I wasn't actually advocating necessarily, but it is, in communicating, it is one of the strong ways to communicate there would be a public benefit if there is a dedicated pathway for the public understanding what was done and its impact on decarbonization.
I don't think it's a bad thing to put in either. I agree. I mean, it's going to, the PNNL looking over the early grid mod programs, I think is a good example of how that worked well. That information got out publicly and it lent a lot of credence to it. And Kate, I do think we should mention it, but Dan, you're right. I mean, some of the private sector funds and whatnot, we don't want to scare people away because all their proprietary information is going to be public. And I don't think that's an issue. So I think putting that word that we should try, like the more publicly available information that can help push the envelope on these things, the better. But I think we have some wiggle room in there. I don't think it's a bad thing to mention, and we'll have to wordsmith it somehow.
How about the investments should be additive or accelerative and strategically positioned to expand public benefits? Something of that sort. Because some of that public benefit isn't necessarily shared knowledge, as Joel was pointing out. It's helping demonstrate or fill in gaps in new technologies, new applications.
This is Bob. I've been mostly just listening in, but regarding some of the comments, I just wanted to discuss a a kind of example. Brian mentioned the solar plus storage, and I agree that a lot of the solar build out is probably going to happen anyway. And what I've observed is that it typically is structured around the way a lot of the programs have been for, say, community solar or utility solar. But what we're finding is the contractors and suppliers typically want to supply equipment that's their standard type packaging. And what that translates into is many times some of the components, and particularly the inverters and the way they're configured to evolving standards, don't easily allow then additive features such as storage or other forms of control to be able to get higher level benefits out of the hybridization of, say, solar with other technologies. And I don't think we've drilled into this sort of thing in the policy yet, but it seems to me that there's a place for the Clean Energy Fund or the infrastructure part of it to be able to help developers or utilities or community solar developers change out equipment or put in the latest standard equipment that would allow that solar to be able to provide a higher level benefit, such as resiliency, because right now we kind of run into that as a gap area. I just wanted to mention that seems to me that as something that we should be able to pursue with this program, even though, like I said earlier, the solar is probably going to happen anyway because there's a business case for it that's been created with previous programs, but it sometimes misses the mark on providing some of the higher level benefits that we're finding with some of the programs we're currently implementing.
I think we also need to make sure this doesn't read as too restrictive. And when you read don't fund something that's already going to happen, we don't want that to prevent us from funding that gap technology, that software, that implementation piece that would dramatically speed it up. The solar panels are going up, but what about the microgrid and security items that need to support connecting all that? That might be an innovative area. So we need to make sure there's some space in there that if it's going to dramatically speed up implementation, that goal is valuable.
Yeah, and
Even
that's
if solar panels are already going up.
And
Yeah.
I think that was one of Joel's points. Yeah. Well, how about if we see if there's a comfortable place to put in kind of the public benefit aspect of this into this language, if folks are comfortable with that, or we just leave it as it is, or we come up with, how do you want to proceed, I guess? Okay, well, let's just flag this issue and keep going. How about that?
I will
All
say
right.
I'm fine with it. So I think as long as we understand what it means, accelerative can be a lot of stuff, so they would just have to make the case that it wouldn't have happened in the way that exactly in the way Bob was describing. We would not be putting in these kinds of facilities without this, and so it's accelerative. So I think that the case can be made if it's clear in the rules, you're going to be sending out to people about how do you demonstrate these things. I think that's where you can put plenty of detailed language to capture the case that has to be made. And that word, I think, additive or accelerative and not would have happened anyway, leaves lots of room within the instructions and within the rubric for scoring to recognize innovation, even in a solar panel farm, as Bob was saying.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. And thanks, Bob, for letting me summarize your point with slightly less science-y words.
So Alana, let's go to the next one. Oh, it's Angela, so we can just talk about it without her here. This was just a little refinement on this language to ensure that we were hooking, to the extent we can, hooking things up with other programs that go on, which is seems like a little bit of a no-brainer. It's not mandatory, but it just pokes in that direction. Does anybody have any, is this one you had a comment on, Mel? I can't remember.
No,
Okay.
I want to argue a minutia detail in point 3 that may be too specific for this document.
Okay. All right. So anybody have any thoughts on this one? Okay, I think we can keep going, Alana. So the concern here was that we not just talk about electrification, that we also, that we make particularly with maritime, we make it a little broader to make sure we're taking into account whatever solutions are being pursued to reduce emissions and fossil fuel use in this sector, so that we were including, for example, potential hydrogen technologies, et cetera. So that was that change in language there.
That also includes clean molecules, recycled cooking oil, other forms of reduced carbon and reduced fossil fuels.
I don't know, would zero?
Yeah, zero emission, I mean, starting to split hairs, because yeah, biofuels are not zero emission necessarily. I don't
You want to say something a little more specific, like electrification and decarbonized fuels? Just to say that you're not excluding the continued use of electric fuels, and particularly maritime, where electrification is hard, but they are aiming for zero emission. Well, maybe you don't get to 0.0.
Yeah. And Dan actually got the kind of term from you. Is it when you say zero emission?
So zero
Solutions
emissions
or transportation. Is there?
Yeah, it would not include probably low carbon fuels because they have standards. So they would not be, as I think Joel or somebody was saying. I mean, so low carbon fuels would be excluded from something that was called zero emissions mobility or zero emissions vehicles. But we may want to include low carbon fuels, or something, because our state has continuously talked about low carbon fuels. But when we do that, we either have to defer to what the state sets as a standard or use some of the federal standards on, 60% of the carbon of a conventional fossil fuel or something like that. There's different different federal organizations, whether it's the Navy buying decarbonized fuels or something, they have different standards. So I think we get into, now I'm talking like a chemical engineer that I am, but the details, once you get into decarbonized fuels, we either have to say something that meets a low carbon fuel standard or something, because there's a lot of wiggle room in defining a low carbon fuel. And so somebody has to define that.
Well, I was trying to finesse it by saying decarbonized, so that it's a little ambiguous whether it's decarbonized to 0 or to X%. But I just think if you pull out electrification and mention fuels alongside that, you've got room to kind of cover the landscape without being too ambiguous.
And this can all be, again, in the rules when we cross the bridge of saying what compliance means, and we have a rubric. for evaluating, proposals that come in. That can all be part of it. So I think we should be as inclusive, to Mel's point, we should be as inclusive as possible to let the most ideas flourish and then winnow them down when we really understand where the state's going, would be my recommendation.
And even in the proposal review, if you have a solution that's 90% reduction and you have one that's 99%, there's a winner.
That was exactly what I was thinking, is if the rubric that's used to score the proposals actually has in it the criterion for the extent of decarbonization or something as a criterion, pathways to that.
That
That's
leaves some flexibility for circular economy solutions, recycled French fry oil or biofuels from forest slash, when we're looking at a net gain of reusing something or preventing something from, forest slash just being burned and releasing carbon that way. At least we're doing something with it.
Yeah, presumably you have some criteria for accounting for the sustainability and the net carbon footprint of a fuel. Just because it has a biological source, you probably want to be a little more stringent than that.
Yeah.
The aviation biofuels project I worked on with Mike Wolcott was you had to show 60% or less of the carbon of a conventional fuel. That was like within the USDA program to be a sustainable aviation fuel, and so different organizations, have different definitions, and that's where I say we shouldn't over specify. We should leave it open, but be cognizant that during the scoring and whatnot, that of the actual proposals, more decarbonization wins. So the words decarbonized fuels or whatever, that leaves it open.
Okay. I think Kate and I can do a little wordsmithing on that and capture those points. The one thing is interesting when we say a scoring criteria within the things, it then gets to that other, within the proposals or gets to that other side of the complexity of and our ability to do that from and that's another point we make later in the document, that we need more expertise and administrative help to do those kind of things.
Yeah, I'd like to comment a little bit about on that scoring matrix development. My experience or observation has been that that's a challenging task for the staff that's been administering this program. And there would be some benefit to having some outside perspective on ways of putting the matrix together. Some of that could be looking at what's been done with other programs in state or in other states, but to leave it up to the commerce staff administering the program, I think it has some limitations there. So some guidance or framework for how we take some of these points, such as the ones we just discussed, and building those into framework or the rubric somewhere, and it would be helpful if we had some more direction on that.
Now, within the statute, there is language. Historically, there's been language about seeking external guidance in program development and whatnot. This is part of that at sort of a higher level. Is there a mechanism for getting people together to work on that and to support your program that way? I know later on we recommend, and I totally agree with this, that there be more funding to administer the program directly. But are there ways in the complicated milieu, Bob, of conflict of interest? We are a state of only 7.5 million people with, we're a friendly little state in some ways. We know one another and whatnot. And I know there's always been concern about conflict of interest. So how do you see, having administered part of the program for years now? I mean, how do you see us doing that? What would be your recommendation? And maybe it's not here, maybe it is in the latter part when we get to the Kate's bullets later on about support of the program.
Yeah, I think it falls in the latter part, or this, subsequent actions to this recommendation. I just wanted to mention that, being tasked with taking a proviso, developing a program and an evaluation criteria that an experts panel can interpret and apply has been challenging. And I know I've personally experienced where we came up with what we thought was a logical, made sense type criteria that was more focused on results and timeliness. And when we first put it out, we got a lot of pushback about it needed to have from the applicant pool, that it needed to focus more on putting a higher priority on innovation and new technologies. And so we went back and shifted it and made that emphasis. And then again, now the emphasis is that we need to add the features or the criteria for inclusion and diversity. And I think the staff, just from what I've observed, how they take a program, a particular type of program or area they're trying to prepare and put out there for notification, and putting it into a framework that is a lucid type program that both the applicants and the reviewers can all understand how it's to be applied. That has been a challenging area. And it's somewhere that investing appropriate time and process to get that input would be add a lot of value to the program. And there's probably others that have been involved in it at that level that would have perspective, but just what we went through recently, from what I understand with some recent solicitations, they could have used a little bit more framework direction.
I feel like that hits on, I agree with you, Bob, and I think that hits on the third bullet under the suggestions at the end. It's too bad it's just a bullet, because I think it's a big, I don't know, should be almost in bold, but it gets to like this idea of having an oversight body that serves in an ongoing capacity to give us the opportunity, staff the opportunity to noodle through some of this and have an ongoing dialogue about, okay, we're about to go through this next solicitation. Does this connect with the state energy strategy? Does this connect with what we said, CEF 5 would do in the focus areas? And so I feel like that is one way to get at that. And that's captured there in one tiny bullet, but I do agree with you on that need.
Yeah, I just mainly, I think if we have some mechanism that helps provide some continuity or consistency across the portfolio of programs, I think that would benefit the overall larger intent of the CEF and how it supports the energy strategy.
I know in the past I've encouraged using the Washington State Academy of Sciences in that sort of capacity as a legislatively mandated non-advocacy organization to support science, engineering, and technology in the state. And they would have the same problem as you without money, though, because they have two staff that support a lot of different programs without necessarily the technical expertise. So they can organize something to some degree, but they would need to have it staffed as well. So, I mean, without operating dollars, it's really, really hard.
Yeah, and that's where I think we get into the just from doing this for a while, like these kind of groups, and thank you all again, we have interest, and the good people of Washington, the experts like yourselves, will step up for basically volunteer panels to provide, like, kind of like Jennifer was saying, like to provide some input on making sure we're taking programs in the right direction and whatnot. But then the others, and that's great, and we're probably going to keep asking for that volunteer support, believe me. But the other side of it is when you really, like Dan was saying, when we need expertise to go dig into scoring, technical scoring of responses and whatnot, or true kind of technical support to some of these programs, it can't be volunteer. I mean, it's not fair to anybody involved, and you're going to get what you pay for to some extent too. So I think that's where the call for more money really becomes important, is to really activate that for these organizations that have or access to the expertise. Because as Washington Academy of Science has found, helping too much on the scoring of things can become what went from a volunteer activity became a full-time job for a few people, and it just doesn't work for.
Okay, we got a little far afield from transportation, but that's good. That's the brainstorming we want to do. I think two more things on this transportation, well, three, I guess. Where did we land then on the zero emission solutions language? Should we change it to some kind of decarbonization direction language? And do you trust us to just do that as part of the refining process? Is that, unless I hear objection, I think Commerce will go ahead and take a look at that language and try and make sure we're not unnecessarily restricting ourselves. There's two more things, which is, Mel, I think you had some comments on this section, but I'm going to turn it over real quick to Michael Barish, who's our transportation expert in the energy policy team at Commerce. And he is suggesting we actually make a change to the some of the language here. And I think it is my fault that I didn't incorporate his suggestions earlier, but I think as long as we have you all here and we're focused on this, I think I'm going to let Michael explain why he thinks we should change. I think maybe even delete the first bullet, Michael, but I'll let you say.
Thanks, Kate. And it's definitely not your fault. For folks, there's just a lot of activity outside ECPAC right now regarding this, and it's difficult and it's moving very quickly and aggressively, and so it's just really hard to not merge those processes, even though ECPAC has been going on for a lot longer. So it's both an issue of an alignment and also with this activity and also where other agencies are. So the first thing I want to say is that I think for the title in number 3, I would support that you don't use the word freight, and I would suggest instead you say the word goods. Freight has like statutory implications as well as policy, and that's really WashDOT's domain, and they always say it's really about goods. And that also reflects a lot of attention around how in the time of COVID, but also in technology innovation, that goods movement in urban spaces particularly is a growing innovation and carbon issue, and CEF is uniquely positioned to support that, and freight is somewhat exclusive of that, and so I'm leaning on WashDOT in the terms that they use. So that's one recommendation, and I think goods can include freight, and it's more encompassing and inherently, I think, targets a lot of innovative opportunities that our partners are asking for. The second one is what Kate mentioned, which is this first point, which I understand where folks are going for. The way it is phrased, though, is inherently problematic to me in that, one, solutions for these different geographic areas are not distinct. They often are overlapping. And I think it's more about targeting where there's an underserved or unserved need. And that to me is actually captured in the gap point in the second bullet point. So to me, first creates a bit of one, it's not necessarily reflecting where the agencies and the private sector are moving and how we treat charging. It's really, it's about assessing on a gap basis, especially when we think about the role of the state and potentially innovative solutions. So I would argue that that point could be more harmful than beneficial, except I think there is, we should be explicitly stating tribal communities, but that can be done maybe somewhere else. And I would recommend that we consider its support publicly accessible charging infrastructure deployment to cover gaps and eliminate the word passenger, because ETS or whatever version this takes moving forward will be playing in a space where there are other actors, namely private sector, other state agencies and local government. And if we are looking for a point, I would say that you could transition the first one to something about more, if this is in line with the rest of where ACPAC is going, is about focusing on innovative needs regarding some known and anticipated barriers to charging. So anyway, I appreciate that these are kind of out of left field, and I know that's pretty late in the game, so I don't want to mess up the flow. And but those are just points that reflect where we are as a state in discussing transportation electrification and how we fund it in particular.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for doing that. And so let's put a pin on that for a second. It's which would be changing freight to goods, and then deleting the first bullet, and then deleting the word passenger in the second bullet. And then Mel, I don't know if you want to, before we kind of take a vote on those changes or get the temperature on those, if you want to say anything that's consistent with your thoughts.
As the conversation has evolved, my point I put in the chat about wanting to emphasize the impact of putting an infrastructure or putting a solution in on a disadvantaged community, I think that belongs in the rubric, not in this recommendation, as we've talked about that could be a scoring piece for a transportation project, is if we have two that seem to be making equal gains, which one's going to be deployed in a place that improves a low income community. And I think putting that in the scoring in the rubric might make more sense. And then the comments we just heard about taking out passenger vehicle, I think does sufficient towards my point that maybe our biggest bang for the buck for low income communities comes with getting fleets transitioned first. And I think just dropping the word passenger probably opens up that space in this recommendation sufficiently. So I'm good.
Okay, so does anybody else have any thought? I mean, does anybody have any change, or I guess, is everybody okay if we make these changes that Michael just suggested, so that we're consistent with kind of what's going on in the rest of the Washington transportation world? If you object, this would be the time to speak up. Okay, I think, Michael, thank you. You made your case, and the changes will reflect it. We may try and work tribal communities in somewheres. We'll just have to take a minute and look at it and figure out where that would appropriately work in. Okay, so Alana, why don't we go find the next one? Okay, we had some focus on this section. So I don't know, Dan, you kind of already talked, but maybe you want to say something here.
Well, I'll just point out that, you know, those little winglets that you've seen proliferate on every airplane you fly in, those winglets save more carbon globally than decarbonizing our entire grid. So that was an innovation by a small company in Seattle that has gone global. So this is my point, is that there's so many spaces for our industrial sectors that are big players. We have big trucking, maritime, we have major aerospace, we've got information and communication technologies, and you know, aerospace is 2 to 2.5% of global greenhouse gases. Our state is 0.27%. information and communication technology is almost 2% of global greenhouse gases. So I just want to make sure CEF is not replacing the billions those sectors, but is making sure that we're thinking thoughtfully about innovation and how we feed sectors that can take things global. Those winglets have been globally deployed now in 5 years or something as part of the Aviation Partners Boeing system. So we can make big differences, I think, if we're smart in sort of how we play to Washington's strengths. That's why I care so much about this one, is because I see it's really an ambitious way for our state to have global impact.
And I think it was at your request that we added the third bullet, which I added a little bit to, but so.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that is, it's aligned with the idea that, you know, our tech community is investing in many things other than tech because they want to go carbon negative, and that means they'll be in our forests, investing potentially in agriculture and agricultural innovations. And all these are things that CEF conceivably could be supporting and helping with. How do we monitor soil carbon in our forests? How do we build a sensing infrastructure? The state's DNR has a carbon sequestration advisory group, you know, looking at how do we sequester more carbon in our forests and things like that. And so I wanted to recognize that we have private sector actors that are looking for solutions, innovative carbon innovation solutions, and want to just make sure we capture that opportunity, you know, not necessarily prescriptively, but there are, I think, opportunities in the state.
Okay, and then Joel, do you want to speak to the other language? I don't know. I mean, are you just, Elvin's not here, and I think he was the one that originally.
I logged in.
Oh, you're here.
Yeah, I was just in a meeting.
Elvin, save me.
Yeah, in a meeting with the provost. I apologized. COVID. I am the chair of the Faculty Senate Executive Committee, and so you can imagine. But I'm sorry I'm late, and thank you. So Kate, what's the question?
So the what we have on the screen is number 5 in the recommendations, and there was some language there about regional comprehensive universities, and the you know, that you wanted us to incorporate. So I didn't know if I want to make sure that this language that we have here reflects what you were going after, and also just make you available to answer anybody's questions or just to engage. And we're just kind of talking through suggestions that folks had and the changes that we made.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for considering including that. I think I've explained some of it in the separate group, smaller group meetings. But basically, for the Clean Energy Fund Round 2, we submitted a grant in collaborating with Ellensburg PUD. And I think it was our first attempt to it. It was a very nice, beautiful project that involved students, curriculum development, research, that was going to help the community as well. And there were some hiccups in the end. But to get to that point of just getting started, we found so many obstacles as a regional comprehensive university. It will be difficult for me to outline those now because that effort feels like a lifetime ago. But it will be great if we can just send that message as well to Olympia, because I believe I've presented in Olympia in the legislature and in the Senate in the past, and it seems like there is this misconception that the regional comprehensive universities don't have the capacity maybe or the expertise from faculty who have research expertise in these areas. And so that's one of the reasons why I provided this suggestion. Joel, I don't know on your end how that has been felt in Western, but that's how we experienced the process when we put it together and submitted it. We were successful in submitting it, but we found that it was rather difficult.
Yeah, I think we've talked about the barriers before. I mean, some of the stipulations as far as matching and that sort of a thing that we've tried to tweak at least a little bit. I just thought it would be nice to have some kind of positive statement alluding to interest in expanding the research infrastructure at all the institutions. Whereas, you know, the way things are structured today, it pretty much concentrates on the two. And of course, if we were to do that, we'll probably end up working with them anyway, right?
Well, this is among the reasons that we're so glad you all are on this committee. So unless anybody objects to this language or these additions, we'll just consider them to be part of the report.
Thank you so much.
So Alana, we're ready to move on. These were self-generated commerce changes to this infrastructure recommendation. It was pointed out that the kind of grid modernization concept wasn't incorporated anywhere in the recommendations, and that could be perceived as somehow that we want to step back from the grid modernization efforts that have been an important part of the CEF investments in the past. And so we just added a little bit of language there to use those words. And then added a little bit of economic sort of development language in that same top bullet. And then Brian, I don't know if you can explain what we've done and it looks worse than it is. It was really some word changes to that paragraph, but it just was easier to just write it anew than to try and put in the red line strikeout. But Brian, I don't know if you want to speak to what we did here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was mainly, yeah, it's actually, it looks all cut off. It's pretty much saying the same thing it said before in a different format. Wanted to get grid modernization called out specifically, or the work there being valuable. And also just economic development, more economic development language to make it clear that there's also a role in Clean Energy Fund to help in that economic development argument, job creation and whatnot. And it's obviously going to be important coming up in the next session and in the future. So yeah, otherwise I'm happy to answer questions. I think it's pretty straightforward.
Okay, hearing no if there are no objections, in fact, there's support for this changes. Alana, I think we can move on. Nothing there, nothing there. And then we go down, uh-oh, and I don't think Tom's with us still. Okay, but Angela's here. Welcome. So I don't know that Tom has been an advocate for performance metrics in the kind of grant process. And so we were working on ways to incorporate that here. And so this is a language that Tom had suggested. I don't know if there's a reaction to that and Scott, I think you had expressed support for that idea, but I don't know if you have anything to add, or is there any wordsmithing needs to be done here?
I don't really have much to add outside of the fact that metrics can get really complicated really quick. You can easily define something that can't be measured in the outcome. And so that's my only real concern. I think it's useful. It's a lot of work.
So did you mean to say obstacles to performance metrics, or did you mean to say obstacles to achieving performance metrics?
I got the impression it might be both, that there had been issues in the past with the grant, and
You may want to then put in establish and achieve or something to establishing and achieving performance metrics, because it's a little bit unclear, just literally wordsmithing, sorry, to try and understand the meaning.
No, I think that's a good idea.
There's something missing. It's obstacles to doing something with the metrics, I think, isn't it?
But I think if we put the language that was just proposed, I think that would get at both kind of sides of the equation, to actually putting them in to grants and then also to actually achieving them. So Alana, the language was
Thanks.
achieve. What was the language? Was that you, Dan?
Yeah, it was resolve obstacles to establishing and achieving performance metrics, comma, where they exist.
Perfect. Okay, and as you can see, we kind of did this grab bag at the end as suggestions, because these were things that were identified throughout the process that we didn't want to lose, but they aren't really, most of them need more study to figure out whether they're workable or not, or how they would fit into our grant process. So we put them in a kind of grab bag at the end. But appreciate you including them and considering them. And that's the end, right, Alana?
That's the end.
That's the end. So, and Angela, we kind of talked through your the other changes that you had suggested, and hopefully you had a chance to review the document and feel that they were appropriately considered.
Yep.
Okay. There was at least two comments that we got that that were difficult to incorporate into this particular document. One of them, Angela, was your thoughts about kind of inter-district cooperation and collaboration, and the need for coordination. I think your comment was across the state, but maybe even interstate. And we didn't include that because it's not really a CEF capital budget. But we also felt like it was included kind of in the collaboration item. Did that make sense?
I think so. I mean, I think the thought that like you could have sort of participation from multiple utilities across service territories, for example, because inherently transportation is not confined to utility service territories was kind of the point. And so like ultimately, you know, how do you look at the optimal deployment of public charging infrastructure? You know, how much in Seattle's service territory, how much in Tacoma's, how much in Snohomish's, if you're talking about the I-5 corridor, or alternately the I-90 corridor, you know, which crosses multiple utility service territories. So I get that, you know, there could be a scenario in which you were to require, again, it would be difficult because of the lack of sort of analysis dollars, but you could require sort of a regional view of why this infrastructure in this service, you know, but I get that it's sort of probably perhaps beyond the scope of this particular exercise.
But we like your thinking.
Mm-hmm.
That's not being rejected.
No, I hear you.
The other kind of one other thought that was shared with us was the idea of demand response being an important component of our kind of decarbonized clean energy future. And Tom raised that in his comments. And again, strongly agree that demand response is going to be an important part of our future. But I looked through the document to figure out if there was a place for us to call that out. But it is definitely going to be in the state energy strategy, woven into it. But not only that, obviously. I mean, there'll be a lot of other solutions that are going to be factoring into what is turning out to be extremely ambitious goals, particularly between now and 2030. So I didn't weave that in anywhere in particular, but it was not for lack of support. It was just for all those reasons. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Well,
Okay.
Only thing I'd add to that is just the specific technologies. Oh. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
No, maybe not. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Basically, I think demand response is kind of a known tool within what I'd call like a grid modernization toolbox. So just like we're not calling out specifically other tools, I would say that is an important tool that fits in that grid modernization toolbox. So that's the way I was kind of thinking about it.
This is Bob. I think if we're trying to identify specific technologies or components such as demand response, under grid modernization, you at some point there may be pressure to identify or call out other specific types of technologies, and which then you end up with this fairly long list of trying to be inclusive of what all those different things are. I agree with what Brian said about demand response. It's somewhat known. It's more mature than other technologies, but it may be some of that fits into the category like we talked about earlier of it may be a strategy or an implementation that's likely to occur anyway. So I think the challenge here is, is it a new or innovative or form of a technology such as demand response, or that would otherwise struggle with getting much support, which is what I understand we're trying to move towards, is having the CEF target those areas that need help. So I think, certainly it's an allowable technology. People can pursue it. But where it starts getting a little tricky is it something new and different?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it something that is already a program that's up and has some momentum?
For what it's worth, I agree that it's a fairly well-known tool in the region's toolbox with respect to non-wire solutions. There may be instances in which it is innovative and new when it's, for example, grid connected buildings, like new methods by which to achieve demand response. But it is, as you guys were discussing, fairly, I think, given the various processes we've had to avoid transmission infrastructure on the I-5 corridor, et cetera, it's a fairly commonly accepted tool in the region's toolbox on non-wires, I guess.
So we've gone through the document. I think we've got consensus on the, although not required technically by the charter, it feels like we've got consensus on the recommendations at this point. Again, as I described at the beginning, for your benefit, Elvin and Angela, is these recommendations and findings will be featured prominently in a report that's going to package it up and be submitted to the legislature. And the report will have some, talk about this committee and the process we went through, and then talk about this history of the CEF and that kind of stuff. I don't think it's going to be particularly controversial. It'll just provide some context for the recommendations. But I will, the intent is to make sure that you all are, know what we're doing with regards to that. Your names are going to be on the document, which is why Alana was confirmed with you all what your titles are, which we just wanted to make sure we got that in a place where you wanted it. A suggestion was made by our the person who helps us with our graphics that we take a picture of our Zoom meeting and put your pictures in the document that way. But Alana and I actually made the executive decision not to do that. So you have us to thank for that. Not that you won't have to go through that humiliation of having your a picture of your Brady Bunch Zoom group submitted as part of that process. So there'll be other very engaging pictures in the report, undoubtedly, but not one of you all. So I'm sorry if anybody's disappointed by that decision.
Well, since this is being recorded, I just want to say that I wanted to be Marcia.
Okay, so noted for the record. But we're also kind of talking about whether or not we need to circle back one more time with the stakeholders that we met with during the middle of the process, just to let them know what the status is and maybe give them a chance to review the draft document that we're coming up with. But with that said, I think your recommendations, we are going to attempt not to make any changes to the recommendations that you all have come up with, because we want to respect this process and respect what you came up with. It'll be interesting to hear if others think we've done something wrong, and then if there's a need, we'll let you know what direction that's taking. What else? Brian, Jennifer, Bob, did I miss anything? And Michael's here too, kind of from the commerce perspective.
I would just concur that we need to decide and in what method we want to re-engage with the stakeholder groups. It's been a couple of months since we had the last session with the group I work with, and I think some of them were anticipating that there might be a third meeting, and we haven't really issued any formal follow-up. So, closing the loop on how we took their feedback and provided it to this group, and what opportunities are going to be provided for further engagement or review or comment. That's something we should probably do in time with what other critical path work is going on with the energy strategy.
Yeah, and as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm feeling a little urgency to wrap up this process, just so that because of that timing. But with that said, yes, I think we all appreciate the value that the stakeholder sessions brought to this work, and also the importance of making sure we touch base with those folks again. Many of the stakeholder sessions included you all too, so. I got nothing else for this group. I don't know if anybody has anything, or if you just want to talk about energy in general. I'm happy to update on the state energy strategy if anybody wants to know where that's going or at.
What's the timing look like?
So it's like down to the wire. We spent the summer doing the deep decarbonization modeling that's kind of forming the technical foundation for the rest of the work. But now we're into, and I sent out a link to the State Energy Strategy website, but there was on October 15th, there was a very comprehensive presentation from the 4 different sectors on kind of what it's looking like in terms of what solutions we need to think about to get to our goals. The 2030 goal is proving very problematic. The 2050 goal and 2045 goal for the greenhouse gas reductions are not as problematic, because of course you've got longer to turn over fleets and do other things, but getting to the reductions that we need by 2030 is just going to be challenging. So that's moving forward. The economic modeling, which is what we've been waiting for, we had to have all that other information before. There's some very high level economic modelers that are going to kind of run that data and come up with cost, opportunity. It'll include kind of jobs information and that kind of thing. So that's going on right now, and that'll be factored in. So there's one more advisory committee meeting that's going to happen either end of October or early November, where a draft strategy will be laid out. So if you haven't already signed up for the email list for the State Energy Strategy, that might be a good thing to do if you want to keep appraised of what's going on.
Can we access that to be included?
I will send a link. I can put it in the chat too.
Thank you.
But yeah, let me get that. So yeah, it's going to be it's going to be a pretty aggressive document. Only a few other states have done this kind of deep decarbonization plan. A lot of states have state energy plans, but not the kind of aggressive decarbonization plan that we're putting together. New York, New Jersey, and California are, we think, the only other 3 that have done anything kind of on this scale. The kind of technical foundation that we're using is perhaps unprecedented in any other state. So it's pretty cool.
Well, I'm going to bid adieu. Thank you, Commerce colleagues, for all the work during COVID, furloughs. I could just keep going on the list of trauma that our society has faced. So I'll stop there and just say thank you for everything. Looking forward to seeing this done, and I support all the changes. So have a great day, everyone.
Bye, Dan.
See you, Marcia.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, Dan. Thank you.
Marcia.
Thank you.
All right, Elvin, I will send out the information about the state energy strategy. I just can't make it happen all of this.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been an honor, and I am looking forward for future collaborations. Thank
It's
you.
been a pleasure, an absolute pleasure to have you on here.
Have a great day.
All
And I
right.
would just reiterate the same thing. Thank you, everybody. It sounds like everybody's going to get going. I will hopefully talk to each of you guys soon on multitude of other issues, but thanks again for all your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.